I should have made this weeks ago, but I have had a disagreement with BionicDance. Odd, it seems to be the season for it. Now this disagreement is on very philosophical grounds, so before I get into the grist of it, I have to explain a bit of philosophy. To this end, I'm going to borrow a scene from Aragon. Now let me emphasize that I am taking the scene from the book, not the movie. The movie was what we call crap. I could not persuade myself to sit through more than 20 minutes of it. The book, on the other hand, was pretty decent, speaking from the perspective of someone who has never read anything else in this particular genre. In this book, the author, like any author worth his salt, has a little fun in the sandbox that constitutes the overlap between language, logic, and philosophy. There's a scene in the book in which our heroes breeze into town and meet this eccentric woman who is sitting in front of her shop, holding a frog in one hand and writing on a piece of paper with the other. They ask what she is doing, and she explains that she is trying to prove that frogs do not exist. This comes as something of a surprise. Isn't that a frog in your hand, they want to know. She explains only if frogs exist. If not, then this is something else. I am paraphrasing a tad, whole, but this is the essence of the argument. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, she is not disputing that this animal in her hand exists, but that it is indeed a frog. She is not disputing that it is, but what it is. She is not disputing its existence, but its essence, what it is that makes it what it is. Many atheists are fond of insisting that all knowledge is demonstrable on the basis of evidence, and until recently I have been no exception. I have made this insistence many times myself, but I have had to change my position. There is, after all, such a thing as a priori knowledge. A priori meaning things that can be known prior to sensory experience. Two hikers deep in the wilderness come across a hermit who has lived his entire life miles away from civilization. This hermit has never seen an MP3 player, and our hikers didn't happen to bring one, but they describe it to him, and if the description is good enough, now he knows what one is. He knows its essence. He has a priori knowledge of an MP3 player, but not a posteriori knowledge of one, because he still has yet to experience one with his senses. He has yet to lay eyes on one, take it in his hand, put the buds in his ears, work the controls, and have a listen. Now getting back to Aragon, one of the main characters happens to be a dragon. I say that, my audience hears me say it, and it calls a certain image, a certain essence to mind. A dragon is a type of warm-blooded reptile, sometimes very large, sometimes very small, usually with a head, long neck, long tail, 4 legs, wings, and the ability to fly and breathe fire. There's pretty broad consensus about just what a dragon is, thus establishing its essence. I and most of the people who are ever going to see this video have a priori knowledge about dragons. But as far as I know, no one has ever experienced one with his or her senses, with the possible exception of Mr. Spock. And so no one has a posteriori knowledge of one. A priori knowledge, knowledge about concepts, about essences, about what things are, is the domain of the rationalist school of thought, while a posteriori knowledge, knowledge about existence, about whether things are, is of the empiricist school of thought. This is the problem with this lady's argument, the lady in the story, not Kate. Evidence demonstrates existence, not essence. All we can know about the essence of frogs comes from what most people usually tend to agree is that essence. This is the reason there is no language of just one person. All disputes about essence must be settled before we can even begin to make any determinations about existence. But as long as a thing's essence contains no contradictions, no amount of evidence is going to determine that it doesn't exist. This is the problem with trying to prove a negative. If we insist on putting the cart before the horse, that is, if we insist on establishing existence before essence, we can't really hope to establish either with regard to anything. If this animal in the lady's hand is not in fact a frog, then what sort of animal is it? And what sort of animal is a frog? If this term and essence are not to be connected with one another, with what are they to be connected? Many an atheist is fond of insisting that it's not possible to prove a negative, but it cannot be completely categorically impossible because this is a negative. Being true would render it unprovable and therefore unknowable. There are two types of statements, analytic and synthetic. Analytic statements are statements the truth or falsity of which can be determined just by analyzing the statement, while synthetic statements depend on evidence. All bachelors are married men is an analytic statement, the truth of which is demonstrable on purely analytic grounds, whereas the statement, my neighbor is a married bachelor, is analytically false, since after all there is no way to be both married and a bachelor. You can be absolutely sure that, if I have any neighbors at all, absolutely none of them are married bachelors, unless of course one redefines married to mean as into his job or his hobby or whatever. On the other hand, frogs exist is a synthetic statement, and since we have a good a priori basis for the essence of the animal we have decided as a society to label frog, and we have rather abundant, overwhelming evidence of the existence of animals that fit that essence, it is only rational and reasonable for us to conclude that frogs do indeed exist. If, on the other hand, they did not, there would be no way for us to conclude it, since things that don't exist don't exactly go around creating evidence that they don't exist. The only way to prove that a thing does not exist is through identifying a contradiction in its essence. Basically, a far and away overwhelming avalanche of evidence can demonstrate that a certain species of animal exists, or perhaps a certain genus, but no amount of evidence can demonstrate that the animal in question is indeed a frog. Existence, being a posteriori, rests on evidence, but essence is determined purely by mutual linguistic consensus, which is what allows it to be a priori. This is the point on which she and I disagree. She has insisted that essence can indeed be established by evidence, but so far has declined to demonstrate. This is how I wrote this at first. Since then, the need for a possible qualification has occurred to me. Consider water. By definition, it has a molecular structure consisting of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. That is, any compound about which this is not true is, by definition, not water. This is part of water's essence, but we did not know this when we as a species first discovered water and experienced it with our senses. Thus the definition we have to begin with, the essence, has in fact been modified by evidence, so perhaps it is not quite accurate to describe essence as being entirely a priori. But even so, seeing, feeling, hearing, and tasting this clear liquid that sometimes forms streams, lakes, and oceans, sometimes falls from the sky, sometimes evaporates, condenses, freezes, and melts, does not prove that water exists unless the substance is indeed water, and so a rudimentary essence had to have been established before we could even begin to make any use of sensory experience.